Master Sergeant Logan Steele grabbed Staff Sergeant Abigail Carter by the collar, looked her dead in the eyes, and shoved her out of a Black Hawk helicopter at 8,000 feet above the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. No parachute, no harness, no warning. Just the roar of rotors fading as she fell through the night sky, pushed by the hands of the men she trusted with her life. And that was only the beginning of what they had planned. Before we go any further, if you believe in loyalty, justice, and the kind of strength that can't be broken, hit subscribe right now. Drop the name of your city in the comments and stay with me until the very last word. This story is going to go places you never expected. The summer of 2012 did not feel like a summer anywhere else on Earth. In eastern Afghanistan, the mountains did not soften for any season. They rose out of the ground like broken teeth, jagged gray, unforgiving. And the air between them smelled of dust and altitude and something older than any war the Americans had ever fought there. The valleys had already swallowed hundreds of soldiers. Good soldiers. Brave soldiers. Men and women who had followed orders into the dark and never came back out. Staff Sergeant Abigail Carter had been living inside those valleys for 2 years. She was 29 years old, 5'7", 143 pounds of muscle scar tissue, and something that most people only develop after they've been close enough to death to feel its breath on the back of their neck. Her call sign in the field was Ghost, and that name had not been given to her as a compliment. It had been earned, because Abby Carter could move through hostile terrain without leaving a trace, without triggering a sensor, without making a sound, and the enemy had started to believe she was something supernatural because every time they thought they had her, she was already gone. She knew eastern Afghanistan the way a surgeon knows the inside of a chest cavity. Every valley had a name in her memory. Every mountain pass had a personality, which ones flooded in spring, which ones trapped wind in the afternoon, which ones had hidden caves that hadn't appeared on any American map since the Soviet occupation. She had walked most of it on foot. She had memorized the smuggling routes, not from intelligence briefings, but from sitting in the dark at observation posts for 72 hours at a time, watching, counting, listening. She knew where the weapons moved. She knew where the money moved. And increasingly, as the months had stretched into a second year, she had started to understand something deeply uncomfortable about what that information meant. Some of those weapons were moving in directions they shouldn't have been. Some of that money was going places that no enemy combatant would ever see. She had started asking questions, quietly at first, the way a smart person asks questions when they understand that the wrong question asked to the wrong person can get you killed faster than a firefight. She had gone to Captain Morris twice. The first time he had told her to focus on her mission parameters. The second time his eyes had shifted in a way that made her stomach go cold. Not the look of a man who didn't believe her, but the look of a man who believed her completely and was afraid of what that meant. She had documented everything she could without drawing attention. Dates, coordinates, tail numbers of aircraft that shouldn't have been in certain airspace at certain times. Names that kept appearing in communications that officially didn't exist. She kept it on a small encrypted drive that she wore on a chain around her neck beneath her uniform next to her skin. She thought she was being careful. She didn't know she was already being watched. The briefing for the operation came down on a Tuesday evening. High-value target. Intelligence had placed a senior insurgent commander at a compound in the Paktia Mountains, a man who had been responsible for the deaths of 11 American soldiers over the previous 8 months. The mission was to insert by helicopter, acquire the target for capture or elimination, and extract before first light. Standard parameters, the kind of operation Abby had run dozens of times. The team had been assembled by Master Sergeant Logan Steele. That should have been her first warning. Logan Steele was 37 years old, and he had the kind of face that seemed permanently arranged into an expression of controlled contempt. He had been decorated twice for valor and quietly investigated 3 times for conduct that never quite crossed the line into anything that could be proven. He was the kind of man who was very good at operating just below the threshold of accountability. His men respected him with a specific kind of respect that is really just a sophisticated form of fear. Abby had worked with him twice before. Both times something had felt wrong, not wrong in any way she could have articulated to a superior officer. Just wrong the way your body knows something before your mind catches up, a tension in the room. When he looked at her, a silence that lasted a half second too long, a conversation that stopped when she walked in that resumed only after she left. She had dismissed it. She was a female ranger in a unit that was still not entirely comfortable with her presence. She had learned to be careful about which discomforts she named out loud. She suited up on Tuesday evening and told herself the discomfort was residual. Old noise. She was wrong. The helicopter was a UH-60 Blackhawk, and it lifted off at 2200 hours. Inside the aircraft, the noise was enormous, the kind of noise that fills your skull and makes conversation impossible without headsets. Abby sat near the forward bulkhead, her rifle across her knees, her eyes closed for the first few minutes of flight as she ran through the mission in her head the way she always did. Target location, insertion point, rally point if things went wrong, extraction window. She was methodical about it. She had learned that the mind, which prepares in advance, is the mind that can adapt when the plan falls apart. The team consisted of 5 operators. Steele, a man named Rourke, who had small, flat eyes and never laughed at anything, another named Cheswick, who had joined the unit 6 months ago and spoke almost entirely in acknowledgments, and 2 others, Vega and Harmon, who Abby had worked with in previous deployments and had always found competent, if distant. They had been airborne for approximately 23 minutes when she felt it, a change in the atmosphere inside the aircraft. It was subtle, the kind of thing that only someone who has spent years reading the body language of armed men in confined spaces would catch. Rourke had shifted his weight. Cheswick had moved his right hand from his knee toward his sidearm, not to draw it, just to place his hand closer to it. Vega was looking at the floor with an expression of concentrated absence, the expression of a man rehearsing something in his mind. Abby opened her eyes. She looked at Steele. Steele was looking directly at her. Not the way a mission commander looks at a team member, not a tactical assessment, not a check-in. He was looking at her the way you look at a problem that you have already decided how to solve. "We need to talk," he said, and somehow she heard him perfectly over the rotor noise because his voice had dropped into a register that cut through everything else. She held his gaze. About what? About what you've been collecting." His eyes dropped for exactly 1 second to her chest. Not in any inappropriate way, but with the precision of a man indicating exactly where he believed the drive to be. Then his eyes came back up to hers. The bottom of Abby's stomach fell out. She said nothing. She knew better than to confirm or deny anything in a moment like this. She had trained for interrogation resistance. She understood that the first thing you give away is always the most expensive. "Here's what's going to happen," Steele said. His voice was conversational, relaxed. The voice of a man who has already won and is simply explaining the outcome to someone who doesn't know it yet. "You're going to give me the drive, and then we're going to have a very brief conversation about how you've been misinterpreting data in a high-stress environment, which is a very common and very understandable thing that happens to dedicated soldiers." "And if I don't," she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen on a human face because it contained not cruelty, but indifference. The smile of a man to whom the next 5 minutes were already administrative. "Then this conversation ends early," he said. She calculated. 5 armed men in an aircraft at altitude. Her rifle was across her knees, but drawing it in this confined space against 5 operators who were all positioned for exactly this contingency was not a tactical option. It was a last-breath gesture. She needed to keep the conversation alive. Conversations were time. Time was options. "You're going to want to think very carefully about this," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was proud of that. "Because whatever you think is on that drive, you don't know what I've already transmitted." It was a gamble. She hadn't transmitted anything, but the only card she had was uncertainty. Steele studied her for 3 seconds. "You're bluffing. Try me." The smile disappeared. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Either way, the outcome for you is the same." He nodded to Rourke. What happened in the next 4 seconds happened faster than conscious thought. Rourke lunged from the side. Cheswick moved from the opposite direction. She drove her elbow back into Rourke's jaw, felt the crack, heard him grunt. And then Cheswick had her right arm, and then Vega was on her left, and Steele was on his feet. And she was fighting all of them at once in the narrow space of the helicopter cabin, with the rotor noise screaming and the wind howling through the open side door. And she was strong. She was trained. She had won fights against bigger men in worse conditions, but there were 5 of them. Her hands found the buckle of her safety harness. She grabbed it, trying to lock it, but Harmon's fingers were already there, and in the chaos, she couldn't tell if he was trying to help her or the harness released. Cold air exploded against her face as she was driven toward the open side door. She grabbed the door frame with her left hand. Her fingers found the metal edge and locked. For 1 second, she was suspended there, half in and half out of the aircraft, the earth, 8,000 feet below her, visible only as a vast blackness interrupted by the faint silver thread of a river. And she was looking back into the cabin at Logan Steele, and he was looking at her with that small, indifferent expression. "Nothing personal," he said, and then he nodded one more time, and they broke her grip. She fell. The rotor blast hit her like a wall of force, and then she was past it, and the helicopter was already above her and shrinking, and the night air was screaming past her ears at 100 miles per hour, and the darkness was total and absolute. And Abigail Carter was falling through 8,000 feet of empty Afghan sky with no parachute, no harness, no rescue, and no one in the world who knew she was alive. The first thing she felt was not fear. The first thing she felt was a kind of white-hot crystalline clarity. It was a sensation she had experienced twice before, once in a firefight outside Kandahar, when the patrol leader went down, and she had 12 seconds to get 7 people behind cover before the next volley, and once on a training exercise when her parachute had partially deployed and she'd had to cut away and deploy the reserve at an altitude that gave her exactly enough time to do it correctly if she did not waste a single breath on panic. Her mind did what her mind had been trained to do. It went to work. She was in freefall. Standard terminal velocity in a stable spread position was approximately 120 miles per hour. She was not in a stable spread position. She was tumbling and tumbling, burned altitude faster because it increased drag irregularly. She forced her arms out and arched her back, and the tumbling slowed and then stabilized, and then she had a horizon. She looked down. Below her, the earth was a black mass, but she knew this terrain. She had studied it from the air dozens of times, and she had walked much of it on foot, and she knew that the valley below her, this valley at this approach angle at this time of night, had a river, a glacier-fed mountain river that ran along the eastern edge of the valley floor, fast and deep, from the summer melt with water cold enough to stop a heart in 30 seconds. But also deep enough in the right section to survive, if she hit the right section. At terminal velocity, with no protective equipment, the margin was measured in feet. She had been falling for approximately 18 seconds. She calculated somewhere between 30 and 40 seconds remaining before impact. The river was a silver thread below her, barely visible. She began to move. A human body in free fall is not entirely without control. A skydiver uses body position to steer shifting weight, adjusting limb angles, creating asymmetric drag. Abby had 340 log jumps. She had never jumped at this altitude without equipment, but the physics were the same. She began to angle toward the river. The wind was from the northwest. She felt it against her left cheek. She factored it. The river was angling southeast. She needed to adjust her trajectory by approximately 30 degrees. She moved her body. The earth came up faster than she expected. The mountains resolved into shapes black against black, but distinct now, the ridgelines visible against the sky. The valley floor materialized. The river was there. She aligned herself the way she had aligned herself for water entries from training aircraft a dozen times, except that this altitude was 20 times higher. And she had no suit, and she was going to hit with enough force to. She stopped calculating impact forces because the calculation was not useful, and she needed every available unit of cognitive processing for the next 4 seconds. She pointed her feet. She crossed her arms over her chest. She held her breath. She hit the water. The impact was not like hitting water. It was like hitting concrete that had decided at the last possible moment to move out of the way just enough to let her survive. The shock went through her feet and traveled up her legs and into her spine and rattled her skull with a force that should have been lethal. She felt her left shoulder dislocate instantly, a white-hot detonation of pain that blanked her vision for half a second. She felt ribs crack, 3 of them, maybe 4 on her left side. Her right knee twisted as the current took her, and she couldn't tell if it was broken or just badly wrenched. She couldn't breathe. The cold was a physical assault. The water was glacier-fed, and it was perhaps 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and it hit every nerve ending in her body simultaneously like a full-body electrical charge. Her diaphragm locked. Her heart stuttered. She sank. She went down 8–10 feet into the black rushing water, and the current was pulling her sideways, and her left arm wasn't working, and she couldn't breathe, and the cold was turning her muscles into concrete, and a small, rational voice somewhere in the back of her mind said with calm certainty, "This is the part where most people stop." She kicked. Her right leg responded. Her left was slow and uncertain. She kicked again. Her right arm pulled at the water. She rose. The current was fast and she was moving with it now, 30 feet from the impact point, 40–50, and her head broke the surface and she pulled air in with a sound that wasn't breathing so much as drowning in reverse. She went under again. She came back up. She was moving fast with the current and she could see the bank now, the near bank rocky and low 15 feet away. She angled for it with everything she had left, which was not much. Her hand hit a rock. She grabbed it. The current pulled at her. The rock was slick. Her left hand wasn't closing properly around it. She used her right hand, found a better grip, and then pulled herself forward, one rock at a time, 6 feet, 4 feet, 2 feet. Her knees hit gravel. She was on the bank. She was breathing. She lay there on the cold gravel for exactly 3 seconds because 3 seconds was all she was going to allow herself. And then she said out loud to no one, her voice barely above a whisper, "Okay." Just that, okay. She rolled onto her back and looked up at the sky. High above the valley, barely visible, a distant sound of rotor blades faded toward the north. They were already gone. They had not watched. They had not circled back. They had done the math the same way anyone would, 8,000 feet, no parachute, no harness mountain terrain below, and they had concluded that the math was final. Abby lay on the gravel bank of a glacial river in hostile territory in eastern Afghanistan, injured in at least 4 places she could already identify with no radio, no backup, no medical support, no weapon. She had lost the rifle in the fall, and no one on earth who knew she was alive, except the 5 men who believed she was dead. She took one more breath. Then she got up. Not because she wasn't afraid, she was afraid. The fear was enormous and real and specific. The fear of the infection that was going to come from these open wounds if she didn't treat them. The fear of the cold that was going to kill her through hypothermia before dawn if she didn't find shelter. The fear of the insurgent patrol routes she knew ran through this valley. The fear of the drive still around her neck and what its existence meant for the people it implicated. And underneath all of it, quieter but not smaller, the fear of what it meant that Logan Steele and 4 of her fellow Rangers had just tried to murder her on the orders of someone whose name she didn't even know yet. But she got up, because the training doesn't ask you to feel no fear. The training asks you to act in spite of it. The training asks your feet to move while your heart is still screaming. The training asks your hands to work while your brain is still processing the fact that everything you thought you understood about your situation is no longer true. She assessed herself. Left shoulder dislocated, needed to be reset, could be managed. Ribs cracked, not floating breathing was compromised but functional. Right knee damaged, weight bearing with pain. Mobile, concussion, possible symptoms consistent, she would monitor. Core temperature, dangerously low. Priority 1. She looked at the terrain around her. She knew this valley. She knew exactly where she was. And she began to move. She had approximately 4 hours until first light. In 4 hours, Abby Carter was going to be someone different from the woman who had boarded that helicopter. She was going to be something those men had never considered. She was going to be a ghost who knew exactly where they slept. She had 4 hours until sunrise. That was the first thing her mind locked onto after she dragged herself off the gravel bank and forced her legs to hold her weight. Not the pain, not the cold, not the fact that 5 men she had trained with, eaten with, trusted her life, 2 had just thrown her out of an aircraft at altitude and flown away without looking back. All of that was real, and all of it would need to be processed eventually, but not now. Now, the only thing that mattered was 4 hours and what she did with them. She moved along the bank, staying low, staying close to the water's edge, where the gravel gave way to packed earth and the sound of the river covered her footsteps. Her left shoulder was screaming. The dislocation had shifted during her swim to the bank, and the joint was sitting wrong in a way that sent a white-hot wire of pain down to her fingertips with every step. She needed to reset it. She knew how. She had done it twice before on training exercises, once on herself and once on a team member who had gone down in a rock climb. It was not a pleasant procedure. It required something solid, something she could use as a brace, and it required that she not make a sound when she did it, because sound in this valley at this hour meant enemy contact, and enemy contact right now meant death. She found what she needed 20 minutes into her movement, a section of rock face that jutted out at the right angle, roughly chest height. She pressed her back against it, positioned her left arm, and without allowing herself even a full breath of preparation, she drove herself sideways with enough controlled force to seat the joint back into the socket. The pain was extraordinary. She bit down on the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood and made no other sound. For 3 seconds, she stood absolutely still, with her forehead against the cold rock, breathing through her nose in short, controlled increments. Then the worst of it passed and the shoulder ached instead of screamed, and she could move the arm again carefully with limited range but functional. She kept moving. The cold was her most immediate enemy. Her clothes were soaked through, and the mountain air at this altitude, even in summer, drops significantly after midnight. She could already feel her fine motor control beginning to degrade. Her fingers were slower than they should have been, the coordination between her hands and her intentions running a half-second behind. Hypothermia didn't announce itself. It crept. It made you feel less cold before it made you stop feeling anything at all. And the people who died from it usually didn't know it was happening until they were already sitting down somewhere comfortable and warm and permanent. She needed shelter. She needed dry material. She needed heat, or at minimum insulation. She knew this valley. She had been through it twice on foot and once on a mounted patrol 18 months ago. There was a section of the eastern ridge, maybe 2 kilometers from her current position, where the rock formations created natural alcoves deep enough to block wind, sheltered enough that a fire small enough would not be visible from the valley floor. She had noted them during her second foot patrol and filed them away the way she filed everything, not because she had expected to need them exactly like this, but because her mind collected tactical geography the way other minds collected faces or song lyrics automatically, compulsively, without being asked. 2 kilometers, in her current condition, over rough terrain in the dark. She started moving faster. The trek took 40 minutes. Twice she had to stop and press herself flat against the earth when she heard sounds that might have been movement once it was an animal, something small and fast in the rocks above her, and once it was wind funneling through a narrow cut in the ridgeline in a way that mimicked footsteps. Both times she lay motionless for 90 seconds before moving again. Both times her ribs reminded her with every breath that 3 of them were no longer entirely whole. She found the alcoves at approximately 0130 hours. The largest one was roughly the size of a walk-in closet, irregular in shape, the opening narrow enough that a person would have to turn sideways to enter, but the interior wide enough to sit and move. She went in. The air inside was still, significantly warmer than outside, sheltered from the wind that had been stripping heat from her body for the past hour. She sat down against the back wall and ran a quick damage assessment. Shoulder reset, mobile functional with pain. Ribs cracked, breathing compromised to perhaps 70% capacity manageable. The right knee had stiffened badly during the walk and was swollen, weight-bearing possible but degraded. Concussion, she had experienced no vomiting and her vision was clear, but she had a headache that sat behind her right eye like a slow pressure building. And she was having to work slightly harder than normal to sequence her thoughts in the right order. She noted that and kept it noted. Head injuries had timelines that were not always predictable. She stripped her outer layer as much as she could manage one-handed and used the material to wring out moisture, then redressed and pulled her knees to her chest and made herself as small as possible to conserve body heat. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but it was what she had, and Rangers work with what they have, and the alternative to insufficient heat was no heat, and no heat was a coroner's problem, not hers. She did not sleep. She could not sleep, not safely, not with the concussion and the temperature, but she allowed herself something adjacent to it, a state of reduced metabolic activity, muscle groups relaxed in sequence, breathing slowed, mind quiet but not dark. She had trained for this. Sleep discipline was one of the first things Ranger School broke you down to rebuild. You learn to rest without sleeping, to recover without losing awareness, to give your body back 30% of what it needed in 12 minutes of disciplined stillness. She lay there in the dark and she thought about Logan Steele. She thought about the exact quality of his voice when he said nothing personal. She replayed it, Not because she wanted to, her mind would have preferred to be anywhere else, but because she was a soldier, and soldiers don't get to have the luxury of not thinking about things just because those things are terrible. She needed to understand what had happened, not emotionally, tactically. He had known about this drive. That meant he had intelligence about her activities that had come from somewhere close. He had known she had been collecting data, he had known where she kept it, and he had moved with enough confidence to assemble a team of 5 and conduct an elimination operation using military assets, which meant he had either authorization from above or protection from above, and the distinction mattered enormously. If he had authorization, then this went up the chain. If he had protection, then this went up the chain and sideways into intelligence. Either way, it went up. That was the thought that sat in the center of her chest like a stone. This did not stop at Logan Steele. Logan Steele was not the architect of whatever she had stumbled into. He was the instrument. Somewhere above him, someone had made a decision that Abigail Carter needed to be removed from the equation, and that person had enough access to military helicopters and enough control over a special operations team to make that removal happen quietly, officially. And with the built-in cover story of a soldier lost in hostile territory during a classified operation. She was not listed as murdered. She was listed as missing in action. And eventually missing in action became killed in action, and killed in action became a name on a wall, and a name on a wall became the end of the story. Unless she wrote a different ending, she stayed in the alcove until 40 minutes before first light. Then she moved. She needed 3 things in order of priority: a weapon communications or a method of record transmission, and water. Food was a secondary concern. A human body in good condition can function cognitively for several days without food, and her condition was not good. But her mind was still her primary asset, and her mind did not require calories to maintain tactical function at the level she currently needed. Water first, because dehydration accelerated every other problem she was carrying. She moved back to the river and drank carefully, using a section of her clothing as a rough filter through which she passed the water twice before swallowing. It would not remove everything. She knew that. She was going to have intestinal problems in 24 to 48 hours that were going to be deeply unpleasant under these circumstances. But waterborne illness was a tomorrow problem, and she was working on today. Then she stopped. She went completely still at the river's edge, one hand braced on a rock, her head up. She had heard something. Rotors, distant but growing, coming from the north, which was the direction the helicopter had gone after dropping her, which meant she was moving before the thought finished. She pressed herself into the shadow of the overhang above the bank and lay flat and did not breathe more than necessary, and she watched the helicopter come in low over the valley. It was the same Black Hawk. They had come back. For exactly 4 seconds, her heart did something that was not quite hope and not quite terror, but lived directly between the two. The automatic, irrational response of a person who sees a rescue aircraft and cannot immediately suppress the instinct toward it. Then the 4 seconds passed, and she saw the pattern of the search, and she understood. They were not looking for a survivor. They were looking for a body. The helicopter moved in a systematic grid pattern across the valley floor, low enough that the downdraft disturbed the surface of the river into white water. They had spotlights. They were sweeping the banks, the shallows, the places a body might have washed up or become lodged against rocks. They were being thorough. She noted that. Steele was not a man who left things to chance, and the fact that he had come back to confirm the result told her that on some level, even he wasn't entirely certain the math had worked the way he planned. Good, she thought. Doubt keeps you looking in the wrong direction. She watched them work the valley for 11 minutes. They covered approximately 3/4 of the area where a body falling from the impact point would likely have ended up. They did not find her impact point in the river. The current had already dispersed the disturbance. They did not find her tracks because she had stayed on rock and gravel where tracks didn't hold. They did not find her shelter because it was on the upper ridge and they were searching the valley floor. After 11 minutes, the helicopter banked north and climbed. They were leaving, and this time she was almost certain they believed it. She waited until the sound had faded completely. Then she exhaled, and the exhale came out shaky in a way she hadn't expected, and she held herself still for a moment and acknowledged what that shakiness was. It was fear, real fear, the kind that hits you after the crisis has passed rather than during it, when your body finally gets the message that it was almost over, that it almost wasn't you lying in that alcove, that the margin had been genuinely non-theoretically small. She allowed herself 10 seconds. Then she moved. The weapon problem resolved itself 2 hours after sunrise in a way that was simultaneously fortunate and deeply alarming. She had moved south along the eastern ridge, staying in shadow-covering ground at a pace that her knee was going to punish her severely for later. She had been mapping her position relative to the valley's known patrol routes, calculating how long before Steele's team, or some other element of whatever operation she had stumbled into, would establish a ground search. She found the weapons cache by accident. She had been moving through a section of the ridge she had only partially mapped during previous patrols, and she had gone to ground instinctively when she heard movement below her, what turned out to be a small group of local men moving through the valley with livestock. Not a threat, but enough to make her press herself into a cleft in the rock face and wait. While she was waiting, the morning light hit the rock face at an angle that revealed a shadow where there should not have been one. A depression, too regular to be natural. She investigated it carefully from distance, first, then approached the way she approached everything, assuming the worst until proven otherwise. What she found was a sealed container, military-grade polymer, approximately the size of a large footlocker, buried under a loose arrangement of rocks, that had been placed with enough care to look natural, but not enough to fool someone looking specifically. She opened it. Inside 2 rifles, AK pattern, in serviceable condition. Ammunition, substantial quantity. 3 grenades. 2 radios, neither of them the type used by American forces, but both functional. A sealed bag containing U.S. currency in mixed denominations. A handwritten sheet in Pashto, and in what appeared to be a mixture of English and coded notation. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in front of her and felt the specific sick sensation of a puzzle piece clicking into position. This was not an insurgent cache. The rifles were insurgent locally sourced standard pattern, but the radios were the wrong type for local insurgents in this region. The currency was wrong, and the notation on the paper when she studied it had a structure she recognized. Not the content was partially coded, but the structure, the timing format, the grid reference system, American operational notation. Someone on the American side had placed this cache or had arranged for it to be placed, and the weapons inside it were going to move from this mountain into someone's hands, and whoever received them was going to use them, and people were going to pay. And somewhere up the chain, money was going to change hands in a direction that had nothing to do with winning a war and everything to do with prolonging one. She photographed the paper with her mind line by line, committing it to memory, the way she had been trained to memorize documents that couldn't be removed from secure environments. Then she took one of the rifles, 2 magazines of ammunition, and one of the radios. She left everything else exactly as she had found it and reconcealed the cache with the same care she had found it in. She needed that cache to stay undiscovered, because a cache that stayed undiscovered could be watched. And a cache that was watched became a thread, and a thread followed in the right direction led to people whose names she needed. She moved away from the cache position with the rifle slung across her good shoulder and the radio tucked inside her clothing, and she ran through everything she had just seen in her mind, and the picture it was painting was large and ugly and went significantly higher than Logan Steele. The drive around her neck suddenly felt heavier. That afternoon, she heard them on the ground. She had expected it. She had given Steele roughly 18 hours from the return helicopter search to determine that no body had surfaced and deploy a ground element to confirm or locate. She had positioned herself on the upper ridge with a clear line of sight to the valley below, and she had used the rifle's optics to watch the insertion point when the second helicopter came in at 1500 hours. 4 men on the ground. Not Steele himself, she scanned for him carefully and didn't find him. These were different operators, or at least appearing different, and they were moving with the systematic pattern of men conducting a body search rather than a tactical clearance. Spread formation covering ground, methodically checking the bank sections she had been on the night before. One of them stopped directly below her position. He was perhaps 300 meters away, close enough that she could see the expression on his face through the optics when he looked up toward the ridge. He was looking at nothing specific, just scanning upward the way you do when you have the instinct that you're being watched, but no evidence to confirm it. She did not move. She breathed shallowly. She held the optics steady. She watched him watch the ridge for 90 seconds, and then he looked back down and keyed his radio and said something she could not hear, and the 4 men converged, briefly conferred, and then began moving south along the valley. She let out a breath that tasted like dust and copper. Then one of them said something louder, this time enough that fragments of it reached her at this distance, and she caught two words clearly. Just two. But they were enough to change everything. She heard her name, not her call sign, her actual name. Her full name, Abigail Carter, spoken by a man on the valley floor who was officially looking for a body and had just said her name in a tone that was not the tone of a man looking for a corpse. It was the tone of a man looking for a loose end. She pressed herself lower against the rock and felt her heart rate spike in a way that the previous night's fall had not managed to produce. Because falling was physics, and physics could be calculated, but hearing your own name spoken by a man who was sent to ensure you were dead, that was something different. That was personal in a way that gravity was not. She needed to move. She needed to move now, and she needed to be somewhere else before those four men finished the valley and started thinking about the ridge. She moved. 2 hours later, in a secondary position she had identified during her morning reconnaissance, Abby Carter sat with her back against the rock, the rifle across her knees, the radio in her hands, and she began working the frequency bands. She was not trying to contact anyone yet. She was listening. She was building a picture of the communications environment in this valley, who was talking on which frequencies, what the pattern was, where the gaps were, where the vulnerabilities were. She had been trained in signals intelligence enough to understand what she was hearing, if not to decode everything she heard. She listened for 3 hours, and in those 3 hours she learned two things. The first thing she learned was that the ground team had not found any evidence of her survival and was beginning to rotate toward the conclusion that the body had been carried downstream and would likely not be recovered. She heard enough fragments to piece this together. It was consistent with what she wanted them to believe. The second thing she learned was that Logan Steele had reported the mission as a success, not the fake target mission that had never existed. He had reported through some channel she couldn't fully decode but could partially reconstruct from what she was hearing that the secondary objective had been neutralized. Those were the words. Secondary objective neutralized. She was the secondary objective. She sat with that for a moment. She, Abigail Carter, Staff Sergeant, United States Army Rangers, a soldier with 6 years of service and 2 combat tours, and a commendation for valor had been classified in some official or semi-official records somewhere as a secondary objective that had been neutralized. She thought about the men above Logan Steele who had authorized that language. She thought about the drive around her neck. And then she thought about something Sergeant Ethan Brooks had said to her 6 months ago late one night after a debrief that had gone longer than expected, when the two of them had been the last ones left in the room, and she had mentioned carefully that she had been noticing some things she wasn't sure what to do with. Brooks had looked at her for a long time before answering. He was 41 years old, 17 years of service, and he had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been in enough situations where the wrong word at the wrong time costs lives. When he finally spoke, he said, "When you find something that big, the question isn't what do you do with it? The question is, who do you trust to do something with it? That list is going to be shorter than you want it to be. Make sure whoever's on it deserves to be." She had not fully understood what he meant then. She understood it now. The list of people she trusted was not just short. Right now in this valley, on this ridge, with her ribs cracked and her shoulder throbbing and her knees swollen, and 4 men below her who had been sent to confirm her death, the list contained exactly one name: Ethan Brooks. The question was how to reach him. The radio she had recovered from the cache could reach him in theory. He would be monitoring a frequency she knew one they had agreed on years ago for emergencies. The kind of informal dead-drop communication protocol that soldiers develop between themselves outside official channels, precisely because official channels are not always safe. She had not used it in over a year. She did not know if he was still monitoring it. She did not know if the frequency was being monitored by someone else now. She thought about the risks for a long time. Then she thought about the alternative. The alternative was that Logan Steele had already reported success and someone above him was currently filing paperwork on a soldier who was still alive, and the cache she had found was still in the ground, and the people responsible for it were still operating, and the drive around her neck with its documented evidence of corruption and weapons diversion and financial fraud was eventually going to either die with her in this valley or survive with her to mean something. She picked up the radio, she adjusted the frequency. She did not transmit. Not yet. She needed to think about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and whether she could say it in a way that would be recognized by Brooks and meaningless to anyone else who might be listening. She needed a sentence that carried the information that she was alive, that she needed contact, and that the channel she was using was the right channel, all without sounding like any of those things, if heard by the wrong ears. She thought for 11 minutes. Then she keyed the transmit button and said 4 words. Just 4 words, the first half of a phrase that meant nothing to anyone except a man who had sat across from her 6 months ago in an empty briefing room and talked about trust. 4 words, and then she released the button and went silent and waited and told herself that either he would hear it and understand it or he wouldn't, and either way, she was not done. Because there was something Logan Steele and everyone above him had not accounted for when they made their calculations about what it would take to neutralize Abigail Carter. They had accounted for altitude. They had accounted for impact. They had accounted for hostile territory and absence of support and the mathematical probability of survival. What they had not accounted for was the specific, relentless, deeply personal fury of a woman who had just been told by the men she served with that her life was worth less than their secret. That fury did not need a radio. That fury did not need a rescue. That fury was already moving through the mountains, and it was heading straight toward the people who had created it. The 4 words she transmitted were simple. The well is dry. It was half of a phrase, an old one, something she and Brooks had constructed together during a long observation post-rotation 14 months ago when they had been running on no sleep and too much coffee and had spent an hour talking about what real trust looked like in a profession where trust could get you killed. Brooks had said that the problem with most emergency protocols was that they sounded like emergency protocols. He had said the best distress signal was one that sounded like nothing at all to the wrong ears. They had agreed on a phrase, split it in half, and never spoken of it again. The second half of the phrase was his to send back. She waited. The radio stayed silent for 6 hours. She used those 6 hours. She did not sit still, and she did not spiral into the kind of fear that 6 hours of silence in her situation could reasonably produce. She moved. She ate what she could find, not much, some dried vegetation she identified as safe river water, filtered through cloth twice. She studied her terrain. She watched the valley below through the rifle optics and tracked the movements of the ground team until they were extracted at approximately 1900 hours by a helicopter that came in fast and low and was gone in under 4 minutes. Professional extraction, clean, the kind that left no footprint. She noted the direction they flew. Northeast, back toward the forward operating base where Steele was stationed. She noted that too. At 21:43 hours, the radio crackled. 1 burst. Short. Barely a second of transmission. Static, and then 2 words, and then silence again. Still running. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Brooks had heard her. Brooks was alive. Brooks was monitoring, and he understood. And those 2 words, the second half of their phrase, the confirmation that the channel was secure and the sender was who she believed he was, landed in her chest with a weight she hadn't been prepared for. Not relief exactly, something rawer than relief. The specific sensation of a person who has been completely alone with an impossible situation and has just discovered they are not in fact entirely alone. She gave herself 3 seconds. Then she keyed the radio and transmitted a second message, longer this time, more risk but necessary risk. She spoke in a compressed, layered format they had also developed informally over years of working together, not a formal code, more a way of speaking that compressed maximum information into minimum words and used references that would mean nothing to a third party. She told him she was alive. She told him she was mobile but injured. She told him what she had found in the cache, without specifying location or content in any way that could be decoded externally. She told him that the drive was intact, and she told him that the mission report had her listed as neutralized. The silence after she released the transmit button lasted 40 seconds. Then Brooks came back. His voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when the person producing them is working very hard to keep them that way. He said 3 things. He said he had already noticed the mission report and it had not sat right with him. He said he was not at the FOB. He had been on separate assignment 40 kilometers south, which was why it had taken 6 hours. And he said something that stopped her cold. He said, "Abby, I need you to understand something. When I saw that report, I started asking questions. 3 hours ago, someone told me to stop asking. She pressed the radio closer to her ear. Who told you, Captain Morris? She absorbed that. Morris, the same Captain Morris who had told her twice to stay within her mission parameters. The same Morris whose eyes had shifted in that specific frightened way when she had come to him the second time. Morris, who she had initially read as a man who was afraid of what she knew, and who she was now realizing was a man who was afraid of something else entirely, afraid of what would happen to him if he didn't manage the situation properly. Brooks, she said carefully, how deep does this go? Another pause, longer this time. Deep enough that I'm not having this conversation on this radio again after tonight. She understood. He was telling her the channel was hot, or about to be. He was telling her that whatever she needed to do, she needed to do it without him as a communication lifeline, at least for now. He was also telling her, without saying it, that he believed her, that he was not going to walk away from this, and that he was going to need to be very careful about how he moved forward. The drive, she said, I need you to know it exists. Whatever happens to me, the drive exists. I know, he said. And Brooks, she stopped. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. There were 20 things she could have said, most of them unnecessary. She settled on the one that mattered. Don't trust Morris. Already figured that out, he said, and then the channel went silent and stayed silent, and she knew he had shut the radio off at his end, and she was alone again. But the equation had changed. Someone knew she was alive. Someone who mattered, someone who was in position to act on that knowledge, even if she couldn't know yet what acting on it was going to look like. The drive around her neck was no longer just her secret. The existence of the evidence was documented, however informally, in the mind of a man who was currently 40 kilometers away, and very carefully not asking questions he had been told to stop asking. She thought about what Brooks had said. Deep enough. She had already understood that this went above Steele. The cache had made that clear. But Morris complicated the picture in a way that it was important. Morris was in a different part of the chain from Steele. Morris was administrative as much as operational. If Morris was involved, or at minimum aware and complicit through inaction, then this wasn't a rogue team running a side operation under their own initiative. This was structured. This had coordination between operational and administrative elements, which meant someone had ensured that the paperwork would be clean, that the investigation would be minimal, that the missing soldier would become a statistic without anyone asking too many questions about exactly what the mission parameters had been. She sat with that picture for a long time. Then she picked up the rifle and went back to work. The next morning arrived cold and clear, and Abby was already in position when the sun came up. She had spent the pre-dawn hours moving to a new location she had identified the previous day during her reconnaissance, a position on the ridgeline that gave her a direct sight line to the valley floor and to the approach routes from the north, the direction the helicopters had consistently come from. She was 300 meters above the valley, prone the rifle across a natural rock rest, and she had been there long enough that her body temperature had equalized with the ground beneath her, and she had become to any thermal or optical scan simply part of the rock. She was watching, and at approximately 07:15 hours, she saw something she had not expected. Steele came back personally. She recognized him immediately through the optics. Tall, deliberate in movement, the specific posture of a man who has spent so long being the most dangerous person in a given space that it has become his resting state. He came in on the same helicopter with 2 other men, and the 3 of them moved differently from yesterday's ground team. They were not doing a body search. They were doing something more specific, more methodical. They moved to the riverbank first, then worked their way systematically inland, and she watched Steele crouch at one point and study the ground for a long time. He was tracking. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Steele was a tracker. She knew that it was in his file, a skill developed over years in mountains and jungles. She had not underestimated him, but she had perhaps miscalculated the timeline. She had expected another day before the absence of a body triggered a systematic ground tracking effort. She had used yesterday to move across enough varied terrain, including rock and water, to make her trail difficult. But difficult was not impossible, and Logan Steele was not an average tracker. She watched him work. She watched him find something, she couldn't see what. But his body language changed at a specific point near the riverbank, a subtle shift from searching to knowing. He stood up and looked north along the bank, and then he looked up toward the ridgeline, and even through 300 meters, in a rifle optic, she had the distinct visceral sensation of his eyes moving across her position. He didn't stop on her. His gaze continued across the ridge and kept moving. But he knew, she understood in that moment watching him, that Logan Steele had just shifted from believing she was probably dead to believing she might be alive. And the difference between those two beliefs was the difference between a cleanup operation and a hunt. She made a decision. It was not the cautious decision. It was the decision that every tactical calculation she had run in the previous 48 hours had been building toward, even if she hadn't named it until this moment. She had been surviving. Surviving was necessary, but it was not sufficient. Surviving without acting meant that eventually the resources arrayed against her helicopter assets, ground teams, intelligence about her patterns from the people who had trained her and knew how she thought would find her. She could not outrun a sustained search effort in her current condition indefinitely. She had to change the game. She had to stop being the thing they were hunting and become the thing that was hunting them. And she needed to do it in a way that communicated something specific, not just that she was alive, but that she was aware and capable, and that the calculus of this situation had changed in ways they were not fully accounting for. She found her first opportunity at 0840 hours. Steele's team had moved south along the valley and was converging toward a position that would take them, she calculated, past a specific narrow section where the valley walls closed to perhaps 60 meters, and the acoustics were extraordinary. Sound traveled in there in ways that could make a single rifle shot sound like it came from 4 different directions simultaneously. She knew this because she had noted it during a patrol 8 months ago, when a teammate had made a noise that had echoed so strangely they had spent 3 minutes trying to locate its origin. She also knew that Steele's radio, the satellite-capable unit clipped to his left shoulder, had an antenna that extended approximately 14 centimeters above the housing when deployed. She had seen it deployed when he was in the helicopter before she fell. She had registered it the way she registered everything. Not because she had planned to use that information, just because she registered everything. She made the calculation, 900 yards, crosswind from the northwest approximately 6 miles per hour, based on her hair and the movement of small debris she had been monitoring. Target the antenna housing. Not the man, not yet, maybe never. But the antenna that was a message. That was something precise and deliberate that could not be mistaken for a lucky shot or random insurgent fire. That was her saying, I see you, I'm above you, and I'm choosing to let you know it. She settled into the rifle. She breathed down to the bottom of her functional lung capacity. Her cracked ribs compressed on the exhale and sent a bolt of pain through her left side. She held through it. The crosshair settled. She waited for the moment between heartbeats when the body is momentarily still. She fired. The antenna exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Steele dropped instantly combat reflexes, throwing him prone before the echo had finished bouncing off the valley walls. The 2 men with him went down in opposite directions, weapons up, scanning for a source they could not locate, because the echo was doing exactly what she had calculated. She watched through the optics as Steele rolled, looked at his shattered radio, looked at the ridgeline, and lay completely still for 30 seconds. Then he said something to the man closest to him. She couldn't hear it, but the man's response, a single sharp head movement that she read as involuntary a flinch rather than a nod, told her the words had landed hard. Steele slowly stood up. He did not take cover again. He stood in the open, which she understood immediately as deliberate. He was doing the same thing she was doing. He was communicating. He was telling her that he was not afraid, or at minimum, that he intended to project that he was not afraid, which in tactical terms amounted to the same thing, because fear that is not shown does not change the equation. He looked directly at the ridgeline. He cupped his hands around his mouth, and he shouted. His voice came up to her, distorted by distance, but clear enough as in the still morning air. Carter. Just her name. And then you're alone up there. You're hurt. You can't last another 48 hours without support. This doesn't have to end the way you think it does. She did not respond. She was already moving to her next position, low and fast, using the ridge contour to stay out of the sight line she had just revealed. She moved 200 meters north and settled into a new prone position and brought the optics back up. Steele was still standing in the open, still looking at the ridgeline. I can get you medical support, he called out. Whatever you think you found, it's not what you think it is. Come in and we talk about it like professionals. She watched his hands while he spoke. His hands were not making the gestures of a man who was offering a sincere negotiation. They were the hands of a man who was buying time while he triangulated her position, and she could see the second operator moving quietly to a flanking position under the cover of Steele's voice. She gave him 5 more seconds. Then she fired again. Not at Steele, not at the flanking operator. She put the second round into the ground 6 inches in front of the flanking operator's next step, close enough that the impact kicked dirt onto his boots. He stopped moving. Complete stillness from all 3 men. She put the third round in the ground on the other side of Steele, 4 feet to his right, deliberate spacing, deliberate placement. 2 rounds, 2 messages, 1 on each side of the man she was addressing. Then she stopped firing. She wanted him to feel what was between those rounds. She wanted him to stand in the space she had defined and understand that she had put him exactly there on purpose, and that the space between those impact points was not geography. It was a decision she was making in real time. I can put you in the ground, those rounds said, and I'm choosing not to right now, today. But tomorrow is its own calculation, and you should think very carefully about what you do between now and then. Steele stood in that space for a long time. When he finally moved, it was to gesture his team back toward the extraction point. No shouting, no running. He walked, controlled and deliberate, the walk of a man who needed to not look like he was retreating, even though that is exactly what he was doing. She watched him go. And then she sat up and leaned her back against the rock and felt something she hadn't felt since she hit the river 2 nights ago. Something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite confidence, but was closer to both of those things than anything else she had experienced in the previous 48 hours. The problem was that she knew Steele well enough to understand what was going to come next. She had forced him to show his hand. She had demonstrated that she was alive, mobile-armed, and capable of precision fire at 900 yards with a wounded shoulder and cracked ribs. She had demonstrated that she was not in survival mode, she was in operational mode. She had taken the hunt and reversed it in a way that he would not have been able to entirely dismiss, regardless of how he chose to frame it when he reported back. But forcing him to show his hand also meant forcing him to escalate. A man like Logan Steele did not absorb a humiliation and recalibrate toward caution. He absorbed a humiliation and doubled the resources. He would go back to whoever was above him and explain that the secondary objective was not neutralized and was in fact creating an active intelligence risk, and whoever was above him would agree that this needed to be resolved before it created a problem that no amount of administrative paperwork could contain. They would come back with more people, better equipment, and a harder deadline. She had perhaps 24 hours before the nature of what was coming at her changed significantly. She used the first 8 of those hours to conduct the most important reconnaissance of her career. She moved at night south along the ridge and then down into the valley through a route she had identified as blind to the known observation posts in the area. She moved slowly because her knee had stiffened badly, and moving quickly on the descent would have created enough noise to compromise her position, and she could not afford that, not now. She moved in a way that was painful but silent, setting each foot with the kind of deliberate precision that rangers call catwalking, and that takes years to develop until it becomes instinctive. Her target was the forward patrol base, a temporary installation, not a full FOB, that she knew from previous operations had been established 3 kilometers south of her current position in the valley. She had been to it twice. She knew its layout, she knew its rotation schedule, or at least the rotation schedule, as it had been 8 weeks ago, which was the most recent direct intelligence she had. More importantly, she knew that Steele was likely using it as his operational base for the search. And operational bases meant communications equipment, and communications equipment meant satellite uplink capability that was significantly more powerful than the cash radio she was carrying. She needed that uplink. Not to call a rescue, not yet. She was not ready to surface to the general military communications network, because surfacing to the general network meant surfacing to people she could not yet verify were outside the reach of whoever was above Steele and Morris. The wrong person intercepting an emergency call from a soldier who had officially been listed as a secondary objective neutralized would trigger a response that she might not survive. She needed the uplink for something more specific. She needed to transmit the contents of the drive. Not to Brooks, though Brooks would eventually need to be part of this. She needed to transmit to a destination that was beyond the reach of whoever was running this operation. A destination that once the data landed there could not be recalled, could not be buried, could not be managed by anyone in the chain that ran from Logan Steele upward, through Morris, to whatever name sat at the top of this particular conspiracy. She had been thinking about that destination since she had first heard her name spoken in the valley 2 days ago. She had gone through the options, carefully eliminated each one that carried too much risk of interception or too much uncertainty about who controlled the receiving end. And she had arrived at something that was not comfortable but was the only option she trusted completely. There was a journalist, not someone she knew personally, someone whose work she had followed for 3 years, a woman who wrote about military contracting and procurement fraud for a publication that had enough institutional independence to resist pressure and enough legal firepower to protect sources. She had read 6 of her articles. She had thought reading them that this was a person who understood the difference between a story and a weapon, and who had the judgment to know when the weapon needed to be deployed carefully. She had her contact information memorized, not because she had planned to use it, but because Abby Carter memorized things and she had read the articles and the contact information had been in the articles and her mind had kept it. The patrol base was quieter than she had expected when she reached its perimeter at approximately 0200 hours. 2 sentries on rotation, a pattern she identified in 14 minutes of observation, a gap in the rotation at the northeast corner of the perimeter that lasted approximately 90 seconds every 12 minutes. Not a large gap, but large enough for what she needed. She did not go in through the gap. She waited through 3 full rotation cycles to confirm the pattern was consistent, which it was, and then she went in through the gap and she was inside the perimeter in 44 seconds. The communications tent was exactly where it had been on her previous visit 2 months ago. She moved to it with the focus of someone who has pre-solved the problem and is simply executing the solution. The sentry nearest to the tent was at his furthest point in the rotation. She had 70 seconds. She went in. The satellite uplink terminal was active and unattended. She did not turn on any additional lights. She worked in the ambient glow of the equipment itself. She pulled the drive from the chain around her neck and connected it to the terminal's data port and began the transmission. The data was substantial weeks of documentation, and the transmission was going to take longer than 70 seconds. She heard the sentry's footsteps returning. She did not stop the transmission. She positioned herself to the side of the tent entrance, flat against the canvas rifle in a position that she would use only as a last absolute resort, and she listened to the footsteps approach and then pause. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent. She stopped breathing. 12 seconds passed. She counted each one, then the footsteps moved on. The transmission completed 40 seconds later. She pulled the drive, reconnected it to the chain around her neck, and exited the tent. She was back outside the perimeter in 82 seconds. No alarms, no contact, no evidence that she had been there at all. She moved away from the patrol base quickly and then slowed when she had enough distance to be certain she was clear, and she stood in the dark and put her hand over the drive beneath her shirt and felt the shape of it against her palm. It was done. Whatever happened to her now, whatever Steele brought back, however many people came into this valley in the next 24 hours, the data had left the drive. It had gone to a destination that existed outside the chain of command, outside the reach of anyone who had so far been shown to be part of this. It was in transit to a woman in Washington who wrote about the things that powerful people did when they believed no one was watching. Someone was watching now. Abby stood in the dark for a moment and felt the enormity of what she had just done settle over her. Not the physical act, the infiltration, the transmission, the exit. Those had been tactical problems with tactical solutions, and her body had run the execution on something close to autopilot. The enormity was something else. It was the understanding that she had just made a decision that was irreversible. The data was gone from the drive and into the world, and it was going to land somewhere and cause something, and whatever it caused was going to be proportional to what was on it, which she understood to be substantial. She had not done this to blow up the army. She had done this because the army she had served, the real one, the one made of people like Brooks and the Rangers she had trained with, who were not Logan Steele, who were the ones who actually lived the things that the uniform was supposed to mean, that army deserved to know what was being done in its name. She started moving north, back toward the ridge, back toward the high ground where she knew the terrain and Steele did not have the same advantage. Back toward the position she had chosen not as a place to hide, but as a place from which to operate. There was one more thing she needed to do, and it was the thing that scared her more than falling, more than the cold, more than the rifle rounds she had fired at a man she once called a colleague. She needed to walk back into Steele's camp herself, not to surrender, not to negotiate, to finish what she had started, because the data transmission would eventually land, and when it did, it would need a witness. It would need a person who could stand in front of whoever came asking questions and say, "I was there. I saw what was in the cache. I documented what I found. I survived what they did to me. And I'm standing here now because quitting was never one of my options." She needed to be that person. And to be that person, she first needed to survive one more night in the mountains. She kept moving. Above her, the sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, the first gray seeping into the black. Another day was coming. Another 12 hours of whatever Logan Steele decided to bring into this valley. She was ready. She gave herself until 0400 to rest, not sleep. She had already established that sleep was not an option she could safely take, not with the concussion still producing that slow pressure behind her right eye, not with the temperature drop that came in the final hours before dawn, not with the knowledge that Steele was going to come back into this valley before the sun was fully up and was going to come back with something significantly larger than 3 men in a helicopter. She lay still. She controlled her breathing. She gave her body the closest thing to recovery that her situation allowed, and she used the quiet to run through every variable she could identify in the problem she was about to walk into deliberately. The transmission had gone out. That was done and irreversible, and she had made her peace with it. But she understood that a transmission to a journalist, however secure the destination, did not produce immediate results. Journalists verified. They cross-referenced. They consulted lawyers before they published anything that implicated active military personnel and criminal activity on a scale that what she had sent was going to imply. That process took time, days at minimum, possibly weeks. She did not have weeks. She had at her most generous estimate until the end of this day, before Steele arrived with a force large enough to make her continued operation on this ridge tactically impossible. She was one person, one injured person with a field-expedient weapon, limited ammunition, no medical support, in a body that had been running on adrenaline and will for 72 hours. She could not hold the ridge against a serious effort indefinitely. The math was not close, which meant she needed to finish this before the math finished her. She had told herself last night that walking into Steele's camp was the final move. She had meant it. But lying still in the hour before dawn, she worked through the specifics of what that actually required, and the specifics were not simple. Walking into Steele's camp meant walking into a space controlled entirely by men who had already tried to kill her once, and who had every tactical advantage over her physical condition. It meant placing herself voluntarily in a situation where her only leverage was information. The drive, the transmission, the evidence against the immediate physical reality of armed men who had authorization to ensure she did not come out of these mountains alive. The only way that calculus worked in her favor was if Steele did not yet know the transmission had happened. The only way that calculus worked at all was if she moved before he could establish the kind of coordinated presence that would remove her options entirely. She was up and moving at 0412. The patrol base was 3 kilometers south. She had infiltrated it 9 hours ago and left no trace of her presence. But she was not going back to the patrol base. She was going to Steele directly. She knew where he was spending the night. She had tracked the helicopter's landing position the previous evening and identified through optics the specific structure he had established as his command position at the edge of the patrol base perimeter. A separate tent, slightly removed from the main cluster, consistent with how he had always operated in the field. Steele liked physical separation from the people under his command. He had told her once in a conversation she had not thought much about at the time that proximity bred familiarity, and familiarity bred the assumption of permission, and he did not grant permission. She had filed that away without knowing why. Now she knew why. She moved south at a pace that her knee was going to hate for the rest of her life, staying off the valley floor and on the lower ridge until she was within a kilometer of the patrol base, then descending through a gully that gave her cover to within 200 meters of the perimeter. She established observation at 0530 and watched the base come alive in the early gray light. More people. She counted quickly. The patrol base had tripled in population since her infiltration 9 hours ago. She identified at least 14 personnel, and there were almost certainly more inside structures she couldn't see into. 2 additional vehicles that had not been there before. A signals element she could identify by their antenna configuration, more powerful equipment than what had been in the comms tent, which meant someone had brought in a dedicated intelligence package. Her stomach dropped. A dedicated intelligence package at a patrol base in this location at this moment meant one thing. Someone had decided this situation warranted signals intelligence coverage. Someone had decided that the problem in this valley was large enough and complex enough and potentially damaging enough that it needed professional electronic intelligence support rather than just a ground team. That someone was not Logan Steele. Steele was operational, he was good and he was dangerous, and he had resources. But bringing in a dedicated SIGINT package required authorization that sat above his pay grade. It required someone further up the chain making a deliberate decision to escalate the resource commitment, which meant that whoever was above Steele had been briefed on the situation, which meant they knew the secondary objective had not been neutralized, which meant the window she had calculated 24 hours before the nature of what was coming at her changed significantly, had closed faster than she expected. She recalculated. She had perhaps 3 hours before the SIGINT package was fully operational and began sweeping frequencies in this area. The radio she had used to contact Brooks and to listen to the Valley communications, the cache radio, was going to become a liability the moment that equipment came online. She needed to ditch it. More importantly, she needed to already be inside the perimeter before the electronic surveillance net came up, because once it did, any approach she made was going to be detected. She moved, 547. She went in through the same northeast corner gap she had used the previous night because the sentry rotation had not been changed. Whoever had reinforced the base overnight had not thought to audit the perimeter security patterns, which was a command oversight she was going to use every second it lasted. She was through the gap in 38 seconds and moving towards Steele's tent with a focus that narrowed the entire world to the next 10 feet of ground in front of her. She was 12 feet from the tent entrance when the flap opened. She stopped. Rourke stepped out. He was looking down at something in his hands, a tablet. She registered a secure tablet, and he was reading something on it with enough concentration that he had not looked up when the flap opened. He took 2 steps away from the tent and stopped. She was 12 feet behind him in the shadow between 2 equipment containers, completely still. Rourke had the broken jaw she had given him in the helicopter. She could see the swelling on the left side of his face, even in the low light. He was holding the tablet at an angle that told her his jaw was still causing him enough pain that he was keeping his head slightly tilted to compensate. She watched him read. After 30 seconds, he turned and went back into the tent. She gave it 10 seconds and then moved to the tent entrance. She listened. 2 voices inside, Steele and Rourke. Steele was saying something in the clipped, controlled tone he used when he was managing his own anger, which she had observed twice before, and which was actually more dangerous than when he let the anger show, because the controlled version meant he was thinking clearly. She pulled the tent flap back and stepped inside. Steele was seated at a field table with his back partially to the entrance. Rourke was standing to his right, facing the table, and when the flap moved, he looked up and saw her, and his body went rigid in a way that was almost comical. The physical response of a man whose threat assessment system has just experienced a category error, because the person standing in front of him was not supposed to be physically possible. Steele heard Rourke's silence, which was louder than any sound, and turned. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression did exactly one thing. It went still, completely, entirely still, in the way that faces go still when the person behind them is revising a fundamental assumption in real time. "You look like hell," he said. "I've had a rough few days," she said. "You're doing." He did not look at Rourke. He kept his eyes on her, on the rifle she was holding on her face. He was reading her the way she was reading him, and they both knew it, and there was something almost strange about the familiarity of it. 2 people who had trained in the same system, who thought in the same tactical language, reading each other in real time. "Sit down, Rourke," Steele said. Rourke sat. "You too," he said to her. "I'll stand." He accepted that without argument. "How did you get in?" "Same way I got in last night," she said. Something moved across his face, a rapid recalculation. "The comms tent." She said nothing. She let the silence do the work. He understood in approximately 4 seconds. She watched him understand it, watched the sequence move across his expression the moment he calculated what she had done with access to the satellite uplink terminal and arrived at the only conclusion that made sense. She watched him understand that the data was gone, that it had left the drive and gone somewhere he could not reach, and that the careful construction he had built over however long this operation had been running, the administrative covered the managed narrative. The secondary objective neutralized had just developed a flaw that no amount of paperwork was going to repair. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who did you send it to? Does it matter?" "It matters," he said, "because depending on the answer, there are still ways to manage this. There are people who would sit on that kind of information indefinitely if the right conversation happened in the right room." She studied him. "You actually believe that?" "I've seen it happen." "Then you've been in the wrong rooms," she said. "And no, I'm not going to tell you who I sent it to. That's not why I'm here." He leaned back slightly. "Why are you here?" "Because the data being in the world isn't enough. Data needs a witness. It needs someone who was there, who can verify the chain of custody, who can stand up in front of whatever investigation comes out of this and explain exactly what was on that drive and how it got there and what was done to prevent it from getting there." She paused. "That's me. I'm the witness." Rourke shifted in his chair. She moved the rifle slightly in his direction without looking at him, and he stopped shifting. Steele studied her. "You're giving yourself up." "I'm establishing my position," she said. "There's a difference. I'm not surrendering to you. I'm telling you that that I have survived, that I have transmitted evidence of criminal activity involving military assets and personnel, and that I am now going to contact the people in this chain of command who are not part of what you've built here, and I am going to do that with or without your cooperation." He was quiet again. Outside, she could hear the base waking up. Voices, equipment, the sound of a vehicle moving somewhere on the perimeter. The SIGINT package, she calculated, was probably 40 minutes from full operational status. She needed to be done with this conversation before that happened. "Logan," she said, and she used his first name deliberately, not because it was a concession, but because she needed him to hear her as a person rather than as a tactical problem. "I know you didn't build this. I know you're not at the top of it. I know that whoever told you to put me on that helicopter has a lot more to lose than you do, and I know that you made a calculation that protecting that person was worth more than my life." She watched his face. "I want to know whose calculation that was, because that person, whoever gave the order, that's who I'm actually interested in." The silence stretched for 11 seconds. Rourke looked at Steele. Steele looked at Abby, and then he said a name. It came out quiet and flat, without drama, in the tone of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. One name. A name she recognized immediately, not from personal interaction, but from the documents on the drive, from the coded notations on the cache paper, from two references in the communications she had monitored from the ridge that she had partially decoded and filed. A colonel, a name attached to procurement, a name that appeared in the financial threads on the drive in a way that was deeply catastrophically damaging if read by someone who understood what they were looking at. She absorbed it. She kept her face neutral. "How far up does he have cover?" "High enough that I didn't think there was another option," Steele said. His voice was different now, still controlled, but with something underneath it that she had not heard from him before, something tired. "He came to me 18 months ago, told me what the operation was, told me who was involved, and then he told me what happened to people who became problems. And you decided not to be a problem." "I decided I wanted to live." He said it without apology or shame, just a fact. The fact of a man who had made a choice and had been living in the consequences of that choice ever since. "I didn't know about you specifically until 4 months ago. When your name came up, I pushed back." She felt something cold move through her. "You pushed back." "I told him you were effective, that removing you would create more questions than it solved." He disagreed. Steele looked at his hands for a moment. "I should have pushed harder." The understatement of that landed in the tent like a physical object. "Yeah," she said, "you should have." He looked back up at her. "What happens now?" "Now," she said, "you're going to help me get to a communication system that I can trust. And you're going to tell me everything you know about the colonel's operation, names, dates, asset, movements, financial channels, everything. And you're going to do it while it can still count as cooperation rather than confession. Rourke made a sound. She looked at him. He was staring at Steele with an expression that was partly disbelief and partly something that she read as relief, the specific relief of a man who has been waiting for someone to make the decision that he couldn't make himself. And Rourke, she said, you too, everything you know. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. His hand went briefly to his swollen jaw. Not consciously, she thought, just the automatic gesture of a man registering the physical evidence of a situation that had already gone far past where he had intended to be. How do we know you don't just use it to bury us along with him? You don't, she said, but you know what you did, and you know what he did. And if you think those two things look the same to an investigator, you're wrong. She held his gaze. You were on that helicopter. You helped. That's real, and I'm not going to tell you it isn't. But there's a difference between a man who follows a corrupt order and a man who built the corruption. You didn't build it. Another silence. Rourke nodded, once, barely, but it was enough. Steele stood up from the table. There's a secure terminal in the comms tent that isn't part of the standard network, but their network. The colonel established it separately. It was supposed to be for his operational communications outside normal channels. I have access. He paused. It goes directly to a secure node that he thought only he could monitor. She looked at him carefully. Thought, the access codes work both directions. If you send from that terminal, it lands in the same node his communications land in, and the node logs everything. He met her eyes. Everything he's ever sent through it. Everything he's received. 6 months of operational communications. She stared at him. Why are you telling me this? She said. He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had dropped to something she had never heard from him. Something that sounded like the voice of a man who had been someone different, once before the choices he'd made had reshaped him into who he was now. Because I've been carrying his name for 18 months, and I'm done. She made a decision. Take me to the terminal, 0622. The comms tent was 40 meters from Steele's command position, and covering those 40 meters with Steele and Rourke required a calculation that she ran and reran in the seconds before they moved. She was walking across an active patrol base with the two men who had thrown her out of a helicopter, trusting that neither of them would break in the 30 seconds it would take to cover that distance and signal the personnel around them. She was trusting that the calculations she had made about their position, cornered enough, tired enough, implicated enough that cooperation was genuinely their best option, was accurate. She had been reading people in high-stress situations for 6 years. She moved. 31 seconds. No signals, no deviation. Steele held the tent flap open and she went in first, not because she trusted him to stand at her back, but because she needed to control the terminal herself, and because if he was going to signal, anyone being inside the tent was not going to change that. The terminal was in the back section of the tent, partially concealed by equipment, a unit that was deliberately designed to look like standard signals hardware, and was not. Steele accessed it with a code sequence. She watched carefully without appearing to watch. Then he stepped back and let her sit. She worked fast. The terminal's log was extensive, 6 months of communications exactly as he had said. She didn't have time to read them. She barely had time to see the shape of what was there. But the shape was enough. She could see the structure of what the colonel had been running. She could see the financial transfers coded, but not well enough coded to survive professional cryptanalysis. She could see the references to the weapons cache, to the routes, to the names of the Afghan intermediaries who moved product in both directions. She could see in one communication from 4 weeks ago a reference to the Carter problem that made her vision go briefly white. She transmitted everything to the same journalist contact point she had used the previous night, to Brooks at a secondary secure address he had given her years ago for exactly the kind of emergency that had no good options, and to a third destination, the Judge Advocate General's office, specifically to a name she had memorized from a legal briefing 18 months ago, an investigator who worked military fraud cases and who had a reputation, even in informal Ranger conversation, for being impossible to manage, suppress, or redirect once she had her teeth into something. 3 destinations, 3 separate channels, 3 different parts of the system that would need to coordinate to bury all of it simultaneously, which was not a coordination she believed was possible, given what she had just sent. She pulled up one final communication window, and typed a message that was not coded, not compressed, not layered. It was direct. It named the colonel. It named Steele and Rourke. It named Morris. It described the operation in the valley, the weapons cache, the financial network. It described what had been done to her on that helicopter. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it was the clearest thing she had ever written. She transmitted it. Then she stood up from the terminal. Steele was watching her from across the tent. His expression had gone through several things in the time she had been at the keyboard and had settled into something she didn't have a precise word for. Not resignation exactly, not relief. Something that combined both with a quality of finality underneath that told her he understood that whatever came next, the thing he had been holding for 18 months, had finally passed out of his hands. "It's done," she said. He nodded. Outside the tent, she heard it before anyone else did. The specific acoustic signature of multiple helicopters, not one coming from a direction that was not the north, not from the FOB where Steele had come from, but from the west. A direction that had not produced helicopter traffic in any of the 3 days she had spent on this ridge. She looked at Steele. His expression told her he had not called them. She stepped to the tent entrance and listened. 3 helicopters. Maybe 4. Moving fast, coming in hot, not the measured approach of a scheduled insertion, but the aggressive descent profile of aircraft that had been told to get there quickly. Her hand tightened on the rifle. Then her radio crackled. The cache radio, which she had not yet ditched, which she had kept, because there had not been a moment in the past 4 hours when ditching it was the priority. It crackled, and then a voice came through, a voice she recognized with a force that hit her somewhere behind the sternum. "Brooks." "Ghost," he said. His voice was rough, compressed, the voice of a man who had been awake for as long as she had and had spent those hours doing things she was only going to understand later. "I need you to not shoot anyone for the next 4 minutes." She stared at the radio. "Brooks," she said, "tell me those are your helicopters." "Those are my helicopters," he said. "And I've got 2 investigators with me who are very interested in having a conversation with anyone currently inside that patrol base." A pause. "You alive?" "Mostly," she said. "Good enough." Another pause, and then his voice shifted, dropped a register into something that was not tactical anymore. Something that was just a man who had spent 3 days operating under the assumption that his partner might be dead. "I'm glad you're mostly." She looked at Steele, who was still standing in the center of the tent, very still, watching her face for information about what the radio had just told her. She looked at Rourke, who had stood up at the sound of the helicopters and was now standing with his hands slightly away from his sides, a posture that was either compliance or exhaustion or both. "Logan," she said. He looked at her. "Put your weapon on the table." He reached to his sidearm, slowly, deliberately, 2 fingers, and placed it on the field table without drama. Rourke did the same without being asked. She took a breath. The helicopters were close enough now that she could feel the vibration through the ground, through the soles of her boots, and it traveled up through her body and into her cracked ribs and her swollen knee and her reset shoulder, and she felt all of it and did not move. She stood in the center of that tent with the rifle in her hands and felt the cumulative damage of 3 days in these mountains, and thought about the river and the gravel bank and the moment she had said okay to no one and gotten up anyway. She was still up. The first helicopter touched down outside the patrol base perimeter, and she could hear voices, multiple voices, organized voices, the specific pattern of a coordinated arrival that knew exactly where it was going. Brooks had not come alone. Brooks had come with enough people that Logan Steele and everyone with him was about to understand simultaneously and completely that the secondary objective had not been neutralized. The secondary objective was standing in a comms tent holding a rifle and waiting. She heard Brooks' voice outside getting closer. She heard him coordinating with someone, 2 people, 3, and then she heard him stop just outside the tent entrance, and she knew he was there before the flap moved. It moved. He looked at her. 41 years old, 17 years of service, and in this moment his face contained everything those years had deposited in it, the exhaustion, the anger, the specific quality of relief that belongs only to people who have spent days not allowing themselves to believe something and then been proven wrong in the best possible way. He looked at her shoulder, her knee, her face. "You need a medic," he said. "I need about 12 things," she said. "Start with the medic." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "Investigators are outside. They're going to want everyone in this tent. Good, she said. She stepped back from the table where Steele's weapon sat, creating space, establishing geometry. She looked at Steele one more time. One more question. He waited. The colonel, she said. Where is he right now? Steele's jaw tightened. FOB Salerno. He's been there since yesterday evening, waiting for confirmation. She nodded. She looked at Brooks. You get that? Every word Brooks said, and he held up almost as an afterthought a small recording device that he had been holding in his left hand since he entered the tent. And about 40 minutes of everything before it hit too. Steele looked at the recorder for a long time. Then he sat down. He sat down in the field chair at the table where his weapon lay, and he put his hands flat on the table in the posture of a man who is done moving, done calculating, done carrying the weight of the decision he had made 18 months ago in a room with a colonel who had told him what happened to people who became problems. He was done. Rourke was already on his feet with his hands visible, and Brooks had stepped fully into the tent now, and the investigators, two of them in uniforms that carried the specific insignia she had been hoping to see, were right behind him, and the tent was suddenly full of people and voices in the particular organized chaos of a situation that is finally irrevocably moving in the direction of justice rather than away from it. Abby stepped back. She let the investigators do what investigators do. She stood against the canvas wall of the tent with the rifle lowered and watched them begin the process that she had started 3 days ago on a gravel bank next to a glacial river when she had lain on her back and looked up at the sky and said okay to no one and gotten to her feet. Brooks appeared at her shoulder. The colonel, she said quietly. Someone needs to move on him before he hears about this. Already moving, Brooks said. I made 2 calls before the helicopters lifted. He paused. The JAG investigator you sent to, she called me 30 minutes after your transmission landed. She'd been trying to reach something on this for 4 months and couldn't find the thread. He looked sideways at her. You handed her the whole spool. She absorbed that. Ethan. Outside, the patrol base was transformed. She could hear it through the tent canvas, the organized sounds of a situation being brought under control, of people being accounted for, of the specific administrative machinery of military justice beginning to engage with the evidence she had placed in front of it. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was thorough, and thoroughness was what this required. Her knee was going to give out soon. She could feel it. She didn't move yet. Because standing here in this moment with the tent full of investigators and the helicopters cooling outside and Brooks solid at her shoulders, she needed to be here for 1 more minute. She needed to feel the weight of what had happened shift not off her, not entirely. It was never entirely off the person who had carried it, but into the right hands. Into a process that was larger than her and that would continue regardless of what happened to her body in the next 12 hours when the adrenaline finally stopped being enough. She thought about this drive around her neck. She pulled it off, the chain caught in her hair, and Brooks reached up without being asked and helped her free it, and she held it in her palm for a moment. This small piece of metal and polymer that contained 6 months of documented evidence, and that had been worth apparently more than her life. She held it out to the nearest investigator. He took it. She watched it leave her hand. And then she said to no one in particular, to the tent, to the mountains outside, to the river, 3 kilometers north where she had dragged herself out of the current on the worst night of her life. Okay, I'm done with that part. Brooks put his hand on her good shoulder, carefully, the way you touch someone who has been through something you don't have adequate language for. Let's get you to a medic, he said. She nodded. She took 1 step toward the tent entrance. Her knee finally said no, and she stumbled, and Brooks caught her, and she let him, because there is a time for being the person who holds everything together, and there is a time for being the person who lets someone else carry the weight. And she had learned in 3 days on a mountain in eastern Afghanistan exactly where that line was. They walked out of the tent together into the morning light. Above them, the mountains were the same as they had always been. Indifferent. Permanent. The kind of geography that has watched armies come and go for 3,000 years and will watch them for 3,000 more. But down here on this specific patch of earth, on this specific morning, something had changed. The people responsible for what had happened in this valley were in custody or on their way to custody, and the evidence that explained why was in the hands of people who could not be managed, suppressed, or redirected. And Abigail Carter was still standing. She had not defeated an army. She had not won a war. She had done the one thing that had been asked of her by nothing more complicated than her own conscience. She had refused to let the truth die in these mountains along with her. The medic's name was Specialist Dana Reyes, and she had been doing this job for 4 years, and she had seen a lot of things come off helicopters and out of mountains in that time. But when Abigail Carter walked through the entrance of the medical tent at 0714 and sat down on the examination table without being told to, Reyes stood still for 3 full seconds before she moved. Not because of the injuries. She had seen worse injuries, because of the way Carter sat down. She sat down the way a person sits when they have been deciding for 3 days whether their body was going to be permitted to stop and have finally made the administrative decision to allow it, but only partially and only temporarily and entirely on their own terms. Her back was straight. Her eyes were tracking the room. Her rifle was across her knees, even on the examination table, and Reyes noticed that her right hand had not left it. "Ma'am," Reyes said carefully, "I'm going to need to take a look at the shoulder first." Left shoulder, dislocated self-reset in the field. Ribs 3 or 4 cracked on the left side, none floating. Right knee, soft tissue damage, not structural. Concussion, mild to moderate, no vomiting. Vision clear headache, persistent behind the right eye for approximately 60 hours. Carter looked at her, in that order. Reyes blinked. "You want to tell me your blood pressure too?" "Elevated," Carter said, situationally. Reyes almost laughed. She caught it. She put on her gloves and went to work. Outside the medical tent, she could hear the investigation machinery grinding into motion, voices giving and receiving information, the sound of equipment being cataloged, the specific bureaucratic percussion of a situation being documented for people who were going to spend months reading the documentation. Brooks had told her briefly while Carter was being walked to the medical tent that the colonel had been detained at FOB Salerno at 0653. That Captain Moore had been relieved of duty pending investigation 40 minutes after that. That 2 other names she didn't recognize, but that Brooks said with a weight that told her they were significant, had been flagged in the financial threads on the drive and were in the process of being located. It was moving fast, faster than investigations usually moved, which told her that the material Carter had transmitted had landed on people who had been looking for exactly this thread and had been unable to find it, and who were now pulling it as hard and fast as institutional process allowed. Reyes finished the shoulder assessment and began wrapping the ribs, and Carter sat through it without making a sound, which Reyes suspected said something profound about either her pain tolerance or her stubbornness, and she suspected it was both in approximately equal measure. "How long have you been out here?" Reyes asked. 72 hours roughly. Without food. Minimal. Without sleep. Minimal. Reyes taped the last section of the rib wrap and sat back. "You know what's going to happen when the adrenaline stops, right?" Carter looked at her. "I know. You're going to crash, hard, and your body is going to call in every debt you've been deferring for 3 days simultaneously. I know. And you're going to let me put an IV in your arm and keep you horizontal for at least 6 hours. A pause. After the debrief. Before the debrief. Carter met her eyes. There was something in the look that Reyes couldn't fully read. Not resistance, exactly, not the look of someone who was going to fight her on this. More like the look of a person who understood that the argument was already over and was simply taking a moment to acknowledge the transition from one state to the next. 2 hours, Carter said. Then the debrief. Reyes decided that 2 hours was a victory. Deal. She got the IV in on the first try, which she suspected Carter noticed and approved of, and then she dimmed the light on the examination table side of the tent. And within 11 minutes, Abigail Carter was asleep in the specific total way of a body that has been refused sleep for so long that the moment permission is granted, it takes over completely and does not ask again. Reyes stood at the entrance of the tent and looked at her for a moment. Then she went to find Sergeant Brooks and told him the debrief was going to wait 2 hours, and something in her tone communicated that this was not a suggestion, and Brooks looked at her for a second and then nodded once. "Yeah," he said, "she's earned 2 hours. She slept for 4. Nobody woke her. When she came back fast, eyes open, hand on the rifle, fully oriented within 2 seconds in the way that military training rewires the waking process so that it skips the gradual gradient of civilian consciousness and goes directly from sleep to operational. She sat up. The IV was still in her arm. She looked at it, looked at the tent, looked at the light coming through the canvas, and calculated from its quality that it was late morning. She had slept 4 hours. She pulled the IV out herself, applied pressure with the gauze that Reyes had left on the table next to her, and stood up. Her knee protested with a specificity that told her Reyes had been right about the debt collection. Her ribs had stiffened during sleep, and the first full breath she took cost her enough that she stood still for a moment and breathed through it deliberately. Then she picked up her rifle and walked out of the medical tent. Brooks was 10 feet away, sitting on an equipment case, drinking coffee from a metal cup, apparently waiting for exactly this. He looked up when she appeared. He looked at the IV site on her arm where she had pulled it herself. He looked at her face. "You look better," he said. "Don't push it," she said. "Coffee." He handed her the cup without argument. She drank half of it standing up, and it was bad coffee, the specific bad coffee of field operations that is too strong and slightly burnt and tastes like the inside of the pot it was made in, and it was the best thing she had consumed in 4 days. "What did I miss?" she said. He told her. He told her for 20 minutes, and she stood in the morning sun, drinking his bad coffee, and listened to the shape of what the previous 4 hours had produced. The colonel, his name was Hargrove. Colonel David Hargrove, 53 years old, 26 years of service, 2 combat commands and a Distinguished Service Medal, had been detained at Salerno without incident. He had said nothing when they came for him. Brooks said he had looked at the officers detaining him and simply put his hands behind his back, which Brooks said he had found more disturbing than if the man had fought, because it was the gesture of someone who had always known on some level that the accounting was coming and had simply been waiting for the specific morning it arrived. Morris had been more complicated. Morris had talked immediately and at length, which Brooks said was not surprising and also not particularly useful, because Morris's knowledge was administrative and corroborating rather than operational. He knew the shape of what Hargrove had been running without knowing many of the specifics, which was exactly the position a man like Morris would have engineered for himself, close enough to have motive to manage the situation, far enough to have deniability about the details. The JAG investigator, her name was Major Patricia Okafor, and Brooks said this with the specific tone he reserved for people who had impressed him, which was not a long list, had been at FOB Salerno by 0900 and had gone through the financial threads on the drive with the focused efficiency of someone who had been building a related case for 4 months and had just been handed the piece that made everything else make sense. She had called Brooks twice during the debrief period. The second call, he said, had lasted 37 minutes and had covered things he was not clear to repeat to Carter yet, but would be as soon as the investigators completed their initial assessment. The weapons cache had been secured by a separate element dispatched at first light. Everything inside it had been photographed, cataloged, and removed. The Afghan intermediaries whose routes Carter had documented on the drive were now the subject of a parallel investigation that was going to run through channels she would not be directly part of, but whose existence mattered. Vega and Harmon, the 2 operators from the helicopter who had not been with Steele on the ground operations, had been located at the FOB. Both had been aware of what the mission was. Neither had physically participated in the elimination attempt beyond being present on the aircraft. Their situations were going to be complicated and would be sorted out by people whose job it was to sort out exactly these kinds of complications. Steele and Rourke were in custody. Cheswick, she learned, had attempted to leave the patrol base during the first hour of the investigation and had been detained at the perimeter. His attempt to leave had been, Brooks noted with a dry economy of language, not particularly subtle, and had been stopped by a junior enlisted soldier who had simply stepped in front of his vehicle and declined to move. She listened to all of it. When Brooks finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Hargrove," she said finally. "He had a Distinguished Service Medal." "He did. 26 years. "Yeah." She thought about what 26 years meant. She thought about the accumulation of small decisions that a person makes over 26 years, thousands of them, hundreds of thousands, and the specific sequence of decisions that had to have happened along the way to produce a man who ended up here. A man who had started somewhere as a soldier with an oath and had arrived 2.5 decades later at a place where the death of a staff sergeant was an administrative problem to be managed. She thought about the weapons in that cache. She thought about where they were going to go and who was going to receive them and what those people were going to do with them. She thought about the 11 soldiers that the insurgent commander, the fake target, the mission that never existed, had supposedly killed, and she thought about how many more would follow if the network Hargrove was running had been allowed to continue. He wasn't doing it alone, she said. No, Brooks said. He wasn't, and we're not going to know the full shape of it for months, possibly longer. She nodded. She had known that. She had known from the moment she had read the financial threads on the drive that this was not a single person operating in isolation. Networks of this scale required infrastructure. They required multiple nodes, multiple people making multiple decisions to participate, to look away, to file the right paperwork, and ask the wrong questions. But that was not her problem to solve today. Today she had done what she could do. She had transmitted the evidence. She had walked into Steele's camp and extracted the final piece. She had handed the drive to the investigator and watched it leave her hand, and now the machinery that was larger than her was doing what machinery does when it finally gets what it needs to run. The debrief, she said. In an hour, Brooks said. Okafor wants to do it herself. Good. He looked at her. How are you actually doing? She thought about the question seriously, which she suspected he appreciated because he had asked it seriously. Not as a pleasantry, not as the reflexive check-in of someone performing concern. He had asked it the way a person asks when they genuinely want the true answer and are prepared to hear it. I'm functional, she said. Ask me in a week. I'll ask you in a week, he said. She handed him back the coffee cup. It was empty. The debrief with Major Okafor lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Okafor was 40 years old with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent careers in rooms where the details matter and where the wrong detail missed can mean the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. She asked questions the way a scalpel moves precisely economically, always towards something specific. She did not editorialize. She did not express surprise or shock at the things Carter described. Not because she wasn't surprised Carter suspected, but because she had trained herself out of visible reactions in the same way that Carter had trained herself out of flinching, because visible reactions cost you information, and she needed every available unit of cognitive processing for the work. Carter answered every question. She answered them in the same order the events had happened, from the briefing on Tuesday evening through the helicopter, the fall, the river, the ridge, the carré, the radio transmission to Brooks, the infiltration of the patrol base for the uplink, the confrontation in Steele's tent, and the final transmission from the colonel's own terminal. She answered with the precision of someone who had been reviewing the sequence in her mind for 3 days and had it organized the way a soldier organizes equipment, everything in its place accessible in the correct order. At one point, approximately 90 minutes into the debrief, Okafor stopped writing and looked up. I want to make sure I understand the sequence correctly, she said. You were pushed from an aircraft at 8,000 feet with no parachute, survived the impact. Self-treated 4 separate injuries in the field, evaded an active ground search. Identified and photographed a weapons cache, established contact with Sergeant Brooks, infiltrated an active patrol base, twice transmitted the drive contents to multiple secure destinations, and then voluntarily entered the suspect's command position and obtained his verbal confession, which Brooks recorded. She paused. In 72 hours. Carter looked at her, 74 roughly. Okafor looked at her for a moment longer. Then she wrote something on her notepad, and Carter could not see what it was, but whatever it was, Okafor underlined it. Continue, Okafor said. 3 weeks later, Abigail Carter sat in a chair in a building at Bagram Airfield and waited for the people on the other side of the table to finish reading the document in front of them. There were 4 of them, a general she had never met, an officer from the JAG Corps, who was not Okafor but had clearly been fully briefed by Okafor. A civilian Department of Defense she assessed or adjacent to it, who had said nothing since she entered the room and showed no signs of beginning. And a 4th person whose presence in this room had produced in Carter, when she walked in and saw him, the specific sensation of a floor shifting under her feet in a way that she had not permitted her face to acknowledge. Colonel Hargrove was not in this room, but the 4th person was someone she recognized from 3 documents on the drive, someone whose name appeared in the financial threads at a level above Hargrove's. A name she had transmitted with the rest of the evidence and had expected to see inside a courtroom, not across a debrief table. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to know why the person on the financial thread at the level above Colonel Hargrove is sitting in this room rather than in a cell. The silence was immediate and total. The general looked up from the document. The DOD civilian looked at her for the first time. The JAG officer set his pen down. The fourth person, a man named Whitfield. 58 years old, the face of someone who had spent decades being the kind of powerful that other powerful people defer to, looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just recalibrated their assessment of the situation they are sitting in. Staff Sergeant Carter, the general said carefully, this briefing is focused on the operational findings of the investigation as they pertain to— I know what it's focused on, she said. I'm asking why it's focused there and not further up. Another silence. Longer. Whitfield leaned forward slightly. The evidence pertaining to my involvement in the operational activities you documented is on the drive, she said, which 3 separate parties have authenticated copies of, including one that is not under any military or government jurisdiction. She held his gaze. That last one was a deliberate choice. The journalist. She did not say it. She did not need to say it. The transmission had landed. The journalist had called Brooks 2 days after the infiltration and had confirmed receipt and had indicated in the careful non-committal language of someone who was very good at their job that the material was being reviewed with appropriate seriousness. Carter did not know the exact timeline. She did not need to know the exact timeline. What she needed was for the people in this room to understand that the timeline existed and that it was not within their control. Whitfield sat back. The DOD civilian said something quietly to the general, too low for her to hear. The general nodded once. Staff Sergeant Carter, he said, the investigation will be conducted to its full extent and at every level indicated by the evidence. He said it in the tone of a man who has just been handed a decision that was made in the room before she arrived and is now making the announcement. Every level. She looked at Whitfield. Whitfield said nothing. She looked at the general. I want that in writing before I leave this room. The JAG officer picked his pen back up. It took 11 minutes. She walked out of that building with a signed document and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a person who has been fighting the same battle in different forms for 3 weeks and has just won the version of it that she had not been sure she was going to win. Brooks was outside. He was always outside when she came out of rooms like this one. She had stopped noting it as a coincidence 3 days ago and had accepted it as a quality of his character, the quality of a man who understood that the hard part is not always the thing inside the room, but sometimes the walk from the door to whatever comes next. She handed him the document. He read it. His jaw tightened once. He handed it back. Whitfield, she said. I saw him go in, Brooks said. I was going to warn you. I didn't need warning. I know. He paused. Did it work? She thought about the 11 minutes. She thought about Whitfield's face when she said the words not under any military or government jurisdiction. She thought about the particular quality of silence that falls in a room when the people in it understand simultaneously that the leverage is not where they thought it was. It worked, she said. He nodded. They stood in the light for a moment, not saying anything, and it was the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence is not a gap to be filled, but a thing that exists in its own right. They offered me early retirement, she said. He looked at her. Medical. Full benefits. Commendation added to the file. She paused. Clean exit. He was very still. What did you say? I told them I'd think about it. She looked at him. I thought about it for about 4 minutes. And she handed him back his coffee cup. She had been holding it since he gave it to her outside the medical tent 3 weeks ago. She had carried it through the debrief and the room with the general and the confrontation with Whitfield, which she was aware was a strange thing to carry, but which she had carried anyway because sometimes you hold on to the small, ordinary objects because the large, extraordinary ones are too heavy to carry in your hands. I turned it down, she said. He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite relief, but carried properties of both. Yeah, he said, I figured. There's a unit, she said. They briefed me on it yesterday. Highly classified. Designed for soldiers who can operate outside conventional parameters. She paused. Okafor flagged my name for it. Apparently surviving what I survived and then walking into Steele's camp voluntarily meets whatever their selection criteria are. You're going to take it. I'm going to take it. He nodded. He looked at the document in her hand. He looked at her shoulder still moving with the slight compensatory shift of a joint that has been through trauma and is still relearning its range. He looked at her face. "Abby," he said, and then he stopped. He had an expression that she recognized as the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether it needs to be said or whether it already exists in the space between them without language. It already existed. "I know," she said. He nodded. They walked. The investigation ran for 8 months. Colonel David Hargrove was convicted on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful weapons trafficking, and conduct unbecoming. He received 22 years. He would serve 17 of them before any possibility of parole, and the people who knew him said he said nothing in the courtroom. When the sentence was read, not a word, not a gesture, nothing except the same stillness he had shown when they came to detain him at Salerno, the stillness of a man who has been waiting. Logan Steele's cooperation, documented and extensive, resulted in a reduced charge and a sentence of 11 years. He would be eligible for parole after 7. He gave testimony in 4 separate proceedings. His testimony was described by Okafor in the only comment she ever made publicly about the case as the most comprehensive self-indictment she had ever received from a cooperative witness, which she said without any apparent satisfaction, because Okafor did not deal in satisfaction. She dealt in outcomes. Rourke received 5 years. Cheswick 3. Vega and Harmon received administrative separation without criminal charges, a resolution that Carter considered incomplete, in which she said so in the one interview she gave to the journalist 6 months after the investigation concluded. Whitfield resigned from his position at the Department of Defense 14 weeks after the debrief room, citing personal reasons in the specific language of a powerful man who has calculated that resignation is preferable to the alternative that is coming. The alternative came anyway 7 months later in the form of a separate federal investigation that was not under military jurisdiction and that had been building since the morning the journalist's first article appeared. That investigation was still running when Abby Carter reported to her new unit for the first time. Morris received a formal reprimand and was removed from operational command. He retired. The specific inadequacy of that outcome sat in Carter's chest for a long time in a way she did not try to resolve quickly, because she had learned in the course of this experience that justice is not always proportional and that the pursuit of it must proceed anyway. The journalist's first article ran 4 months after the transmission. It was 11,000 words long. It named names, documented financial flows, traced weapons movements, and described in careful and precisely verified detail what had happened in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan to a staff sergeant who had found out too much. It did not name Carter by name. She had asked for that. The journalist had agreed without hesitation. The second article, 6 weeks later, named her. Carter had gone back to the journalist by then and said that the anonymity had served its purpose during the investigation, but that the story of what had actually happened, the fall, the river, the ridge, the 3 days deserved to be told with her name attached to it, because a story told without a name is a lesson, but a story told with a name is a person, and people are harder to dismiss than lessons. The second article ran on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, it had been read by enough people that the Army received, according to a figure Brooks relayed to her, approximately 400 congressional inquiries in 48 hours. She heard about the number and felt nothing dramatic about it. She was by that point 3 weeks into her assignment to the new unit, and the work was absorbing and serious and difficult, and was the kind of work that did not permit you to spend a great deal of time thinking about 400 congressional inquiries, because the work in front of you was always more immediate and more real than the noise behind you. She was for the first time in 3 years doing exactly the work she was supposed to be doing. On a Thursday evening, 6 months after she had walked out of Steele's tent with Brooks at her side, Abby Carter sat in a room with 9 other soldiers. The room was classified. The unit was classified. The nature of the work they were preparing to do was classified. None of them were supposed to be there in the sense that their files said one thing and their actual assignment said another, and the people who knew the difference could be counted on both hands. One of the 9 looked at her at some point during the evening, a soldier whose name she would not use here and whose service history she would describe only as extensive, and said, "I read what happened to you." She looked at him. "You really walked in there on your own," he said, "into Steele's camp after 3 days." Yes, he thought about that for a moment. Why? She had been asked this question before, by Okafor, by the general, by the journalist, by Brooks, though his version of it had been quieter and more personal. She had given different answers to different people at different times because the true answer had more than one layer, and the appropriate layer depended on who was asking and why. But this man was a soldier. He was asking as a soldier. She gave him the soldier's answer. Because the data being out there wasn't enough, she said. Evidence needs a witness. Truth needs a person willing to stand next to it and say, this is real. I was there and I'm not going anywhere. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded once. The nod of a person who has received an answer that they recognize as accurate, not because they were told it was, but because they have lived the same underlying principle in a different form. The room moved on to the work. Later, much later, after the investigation had concluded and the articles had run and the courtrooms had done what courtrooms do, someone asked Abby Carter what she wanted people to take from what had happened to her. A researcher, working on something academic about resilience and institutional corruption and the individuals who navigate the intersection of the two. She thought about it for a long time before she answered. She thought about the helicopter and the open door and Logan Steele's small, indifferent smile and the word nothing before the word personal. She thought about the river. She thought about getting up off the gravel bank and saying okay to no one. She thought about the drive around her neck and the weight of it through 3 days of cold and pain and the specific loneliness of being the only person in the world who knew you were still alive. She thought about Brooks outside the room with his bad coffee and the document in her hand and the walk after. I want people to understand, she said finally, that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person is make them believe their life has no value. Because some people, the ones who have spent years being trained to find a way when there isn't one, will take that belief and use it as fuel. She paused. Logan Steele thought he was ending a problem. What he actually did was remove every constraint I had. He took away my rank and my unit and my status and my safety and my certainty about who I could trust. He left me with nothing except the training and the will to use it. She looked at the researcher. He made me more dangerous, not less. That's the mistake that people who rely on power to silence other people always make. They think removing someone's advantages removes their capability. It doesn't. It just removes the things that were slowing them down. The researcher wrote for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "Is there anything you wish had been different?" Carter thought about that too. "No," she said. "I wish Hargrove had been a different person. I wish Steele had made a different choice 18 months earlier. I wish Morris had said something instead of nothing." She paused. "But I don't wish I'd been different because the person I was, the training, the stubbornness, the thing that wouldn't let me sit down on that gravel bank and wait to die, that's the person who got through it." She held the researcher's gaze. "You don't get to keep that person and also wish the circumstances had been easier. The circumstances made the person visible, even to herself." That interview was never published in full, but the sentence that ended it, the last thing Carter said before she stood up and put on her jacket and walked back to the work, made it into the researcher's final paper, and from there into a training manual that was used for years afterward in a specific kind of selection course for a specific kind of soldier. The sentence was simple. It was not dramatic. It did not reach for poetry or weight. It was the sentence of a person who had been to the bottom of the worst thing that had ever happened to her and had come back up with something specific and true. She said, "They threw me from the sky because they thought gravity would finish the job. What they didn't understand is that Rangers don't survive because the odds are in their favor. Rangers survive because we decided a long time before the worst moment that quitting was never going to be one of our options. And when the worst moment comes, and it always comes, that decision is already made. There's nothing left to decide. There's only the work." She stood up. She put on her jacket. She walked back to the work, and that is where the story of Abigail Carter ends. Not with a ceremony, not with a medal, not with a moment of public recognition in a room full of people who understand what she did. It ends with a soldier at her desk in a classified room doing the next thing and the thing after that and the thing after that. Because that is what Rangers do. Not because they are fearless, not because they are extraordinary, but because a long time ago in training and in fire, And in the slow accumulation of days that build a person into something the worst circumstances cannot break, they made a decision that has no exceptions and no expiration date. They decided that quitting was never going to be one of their options. And Abigail Carter, thrown from a helicopter at 8,000 feet, left for dead, in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, listed as a secondary objective neutralized, proved one gravel bank and one river and one impossible ridge at a time that some decisions once made are simply permanent.